this story hasn't been talked about too much, but officials in say that Taiwan needs to become a porcupine with enough weapons to hold out if Chinese military blockades and invades it, even if Washington decides to send its troops. So this was written last week. But, there's still been talk about Taiwan. There's always this talk about, well, it's not just Ukraine. Taiwan could be also a nuclear flashpoint. There is some concern about that among some sections of the progressive intelligentsia, liberal intelligentsia, but also it's just a constant foreign policy point. That's not going to let up anytime soon. So we need to talk about China. China's about to have its 20th CPC National Congress, which is going to be very important in formulating the next 5-year plan for China. And we're going to see China's stability on display very soon. In 5 days, it starts. And so we can expect more propaganda to ramp up against China. So the New York Times admits this, though, that Taiwan, which is part of China, is being turned into a weapons depot by the U.S. And it says American officials are intensifying efforts to build a giant stockpile of weapons in Taiwan after studying recent naval and air force exercises by the Chinese military around the island, according to current and former officials. The exercises show that China would probably blockade the island as a prelude to any attempted invasion, and Taiwan would have to hold out on its own until the U.S. and other nations intervened, if they decided to do that, the current and former officials say. So when you say current and former officials, the intelligence apparatus, just always remember that that's who they're talking about. They're always anonymous. You can't know who they are. They don't want to reveal themselves, but they're giving information to the New York Times to promote their narrative. It is unclear how China might respond if the United States accelerates shipments of weapons to Taiwan, a democratic, self-governing island that Beijing claims is Chinese territory. Oh, no. China doesn't claim. The U.S. has signed on to 3 different communiques where the U.S. says, all right? China doesn't claim. U.S. officials are determining the quantity and types of weapons sold to Taiwan by quietly telling Taiwanese officials and American arms makers that they will reject orders for some large systems in favor of a greater number of smaller, more mobile weapons. The Biden administration announced on September 2nd that it approved its 6 weapons package for Taiwan, a $1.1 billion sale that includes 60 Harpoon coastal anti-ship missiles. U.S. officials are also discussing how to streamline the sale and delivery process. Biden said last month that the United States is not encouraging Taiwan's independence, adding that's their decision. Since 1979, Washington has had a policy of reassuring Beijing that it does not support independence, but China's foreign minister Wang Yi said at a speech at the Asia Society last month that the U.S. was undermining that position by, quote, by repeated official exchanges and arms sales, including many offensive weapons, end quote. So the reason why, and they're about to get into it, that China wants to increase arms sales, that U.S. wants to increase arms sales to Taiwan also is because of what they're about to say. So in August, after Nancy Pelosi flew into Taiwan, China carried out exercises with naval ships and fighter jet zones close to the island. It fired ballistic missiles as well into waters off of Taiwan's coast, 4 of which went over the island, according to Japan. So this was after Pelosi's visit with Taiwan. But even before this, Taiwan and U.S. officials had been closely examining the potential of an invasion because Russia's assault on Ukraine had made the possibility seem more real, though Chinese leaders have not explicitly stated a timeline for establishing rule over Taiwan. So that's think about this. The United States, what do you think this sounds like? The United States and supposedly Taiwan officials, which of course means Tsai Ing-wen and all of these puppets that the United States has cultivated in Taiwan, these anti-China puppets, what they're saying is this ridiculous comparison that, because Russia conducted a military operation in Ukraine, that means China is next. Well, the situation's a lot different. Taiwan is China's sovereign territory. Ukraine is being used as a pawn of NATO to militarily encircle and really come up against Russia's border and kill Russian-speaking people, Russians who consider themselves Russian. It's a lot different than what's happening with Taiwan. But nonetheless, this has been the narrative that's been spun. It seems more real what China could do. So that's just really a blank check for the U.S. military industrial complex to say, All right, let's pump it full of weapons. Let's pump Taiwan full of weapons. And that's what's been happening. The US would not be able to resupply Taiwan as easily as Ukraine because of the lack of ground routes from neighboring countries. The goal now, officials say, is to ensure that Taiwan has enough arms to defend itself until help arrives. Mr. Biden said last month that US troops would defend Taiwan if China were to carry out an unprecedented attack on the island, the fourth time he stated such a commitment and a shift from the preference of strategic ambiguity on Taiwan among other US presidents. Stockpiling Taiwan is a very active point of discussion, said Jacob Stokes, a fellow at the Center of New American Security, just one of those think tanks that is funded by the military industrial complex, right? Funded by the Pentagon. It gets all sorts of lucrative contracts from corporations like Raytheon, which you know that guy, Lloyd Austin, is the defense secretary of Biden's administration. But this Jacob Stokes, right? This military industrial complex salesperson posing as a expert in a think tank. And if you have it, how do you harden it and how do you disperse it so Chinese missiles can't destroy it, meaning stockpiling Taiwan with weapons? The view is we need to lengthen the amount of time Taiwan can hold out on its own. That's how you avoid China picking the low-hanging fruit of its fait accompli strategy, that they've won the day before we've gotten there. That is assuming we intervene. I mean, does this sound like bloodlust to you? Because it sounds like bloodlust to me. U.S. officials increasingly emphasize Taiwan's need for smaller, mobile weapons that can be lethal against Chinese warships and jets while being able to evade attacks, which is central to so-called asymmetric warfare. Shoot and scoot types of armaments are popular with Ukraine's military, which has used shoulder-fired Javelin and NLAW anti-tank guided missiles and Stinger anti-aircraft missiles effectively against Russian forces. Recently, Ukraine has pummeled Russian troops with mobile American-made rocket launchers known as HIMARS. Well, not for long. I mean, this, of course, is glossing over the truth of the matter, which is these weapons are running out, and also a lot of them are not even making it to the front lines. But Ukraine is victorious, supposedly, even though we're not going to be singing the same tune over the next couple months. I can guarantee you that. To transform Taiwan into a quote-unquote porcupine, an entity bristling with armaments would be costly to attack. American officials have been trying to steer Taiwan's counterparts toward ordering more of those weapons, and fewer systems for conventional ground war like M1 Abrams tanks. Pentagon and State Department officials have also been speaking regularly about these issues since March with American arms corporations, including at an industry conference on Taiwan this week in Richmond, Virginia. Jedediah Royale, a Defense Department official, said in a speech that the Pentagon was helping Taiwan build out systems for an island defense against an aggressor with conventional overmatch. In a recent article by James Timby, a former State Department official, do you see who they're talking to? This is always the case with foreign policy with China. They're just talking to government heads. They're just talking to intelligence, the anonymous officials. Then they're talking to Pentagon officials. Then they're talking to State Department officials. Then they're talking to Pentagon and State Department and military contractor funded think tanks, right? It's all just one big club of warmongering, right? That's being supposedly reported to you as news. So James Timby and James O. Ellis Jr., who's a retired U.S. Navy admiral, said Taiwan needs, quote, a large number of small things, end quote, for distributed defense. That some of Taiwan's recent purchases from the U.S., including Harpoon and Stinger missiles, fit that bill. Taiwan also produces its own deterrent weapons, including mine layer ships, air defensive missile systems, and anti-cruise missiles. When you think about who this article is talking to, it literally sounds like an advertisement. Look at all these weapons. Look at this is what they need. So you should then sell these weapons to them. And then Taiwan, you should buy these weapons. It sounds like one big advertisement for war. They said Taiwan needs to shift resources away from expensive, high-profile conventional systems that China can easily destroy in an initial attack, though some of those systems, notably F-16 jets, are useful for countering ongoing Chinese fighter jet and ship activities in quote-unquote gray zone airspace and waters. AKA the U.S. should not be talking about anything about gray zone waters because it literally is trying to say that it has established an air defense identification zone over Taiwan and part of mainland China. It literally created that after World War II. The hypocrisy is just out of control. The authors also wrote that the effective defense of Taiwan will require stockpiling ammunition, fuel, and other supplies, as well as strategic reserves of food and energy. Officials in the administration of Tsai Ing-wen, the president of Taiwan, say they recognize the need to stockpile smaller weapons, but point out that there are significant lags between orders and shipments. I think we're moving in a high degree of consensus in terms of our priorities of the asymmetric strategy, but the speed does have to be accelerated. More money, more weapons, more money, more weapons. Do you hear this? So then they talk about the Taiwan Policy Act, which would, right? This is a lobby for this act. It would send $6.5 billion in security assistance to Taiwan over the next 4 years and mandate treating the island as if it were a major non-NATO ally. But then you have Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, who said in an interview that weapons makers want to see predictability in orders before committing to building up on production. Arms directors of the U.S. and more than 40 other nations met last week in Brussels to discuss long-term supply and production issues. So if China decides to establish a naval blockade around Taiwan, American officials would probably study which avenue for supplying Taiwan by air or by sea would offer the least likelihood of bringing Chinese and American ships, aircraft, and submarines into direct conflict. So they're already telling you they're thinking about direct conflict. They're telling you right to your face that they want to do everything they can to both escalate and then possibly avoid a direct conflict, even though they're making it so it's much more likely. One proposition would be sending U.S. cargo planes with supplies from bases in Japan and Guam to Taiwan's east coast. That way, any Chinese fighters trying to shoot them down would have to fly over Taiwan and risk being down by Taiwan's planes. The sheer amount of material would likely be needed in case of war is formidable, and getting them through would be difficult, although it may be doable, said Eric Wertheim, a defense consultant and author of the Naval Institute Guide to Combat Fleets of the World. The question is, how much risk is China and the White House willing to take in terms of enforcing or breaking through a blockade, respectively, and can it be sustained? So then it's going to talk about, China's worried about Ukraine, right? I don't have to read the rest of it. China's worried about Ukraine. It's worried about Russia. They may overstep their bounds, just like Russia did. It's all kind of wishful thinking, in my opinion, because for one, what that article was saying just right there was saying that it was revealing why the United States has conducted this pivot to Asia too, because this pivot to Asia, this militarization of the entire Asia Pacific, right? Sending bases, sending troops, sending weapons to places like Guam, to places like Japan, to South Korea, to, on and on and on. The Philippines, which is less cooperative lately. But, we can go on and on and on. The whole Asia Pacific, Marshall Islands, right, has this security, and then Taiwan, of course, right, has this characteristic to it. It is being occupied by the United States. And this is one of the reasons why. They're literally telling us that Taiwan is going to be used in this way, that there's going to be shipments of arms if a war with China were to break out. The United States would try to use its occupied territories in the Asia Pacific to wage this war against China while trying to avoid supposedly direct conflict. It's absolutely just so dangerous. They always reveal in these articles what they're actually thinking, but their audience is to, of course, right, rich people, smug elitists, liberals who read the New York Times, neocons who read the New York Times, weapons contractors that read the New York Times. I mean, of course, it's for the establishment. But if you read it outside of the establishment and really look between the lines of what they're saying that they're thinking about war with China, and they're trying to turn Taiwan into a U.S. weapons depot to prepare for it. That's what this is saying. And that would mean nuclear war and, of course, the end of humanity. So that's where the U.S. foreign policy establishment is and where it's heading. And that's why it's important to counter just as fervently, just as strongly the anti-Russia propaganda, right? To talk about how the demonization of Putin, of Russia, of Russia's government, of the special military operation, the lionization of Ukraine, all of this is all part of a propaganda war to fuel actual war, an actual proxy war, an actual NATO-led escalation, confrontation. It's important to do that, but we have to be just as strong about China, because this is a parallel process. This is a two-front war. This is about the survival of U.S. hegemony. It is about maintaining this empire. It's about expanding it at all costs. This is the end goal. It's not merely great power competition. It's not merely, oh, we're just competing, or there's going to be many big powers in the world, so mutually assured destruction with nuclear weapons is going to protect us all, and these countries can just go about it on their own. No, that's not how this is not how things work. Imperialism is not something that can be reformed. It's not restrainable. It has very clear objectives. It has a very clear mode of production, a very clear set of social relations. All of them are moving toward this very dangerous situation because China and Russia are existential threats to U.S. hegemony in a good way, in a way that benefits people and not super profits for a tiny minority of capitalists and oligarchs and military contractors and energy suppliers and the monopolies.